DragonRuby Game Toolkit lessons learned. The engine is currently free throughout the conference. So DragonRuby.io, you can grab your license there. And quick addendum to my abstract: between the time I wrote it and today, we have 2 more monsters. That's Princess Donut. She eats an hour every day. Like every hour she'll eat something, and then Freddie Mookow. So tips and donations are welcome because she eats a lot. But yeah, so let's briefly talk about the game engine. It is one of the top-rated game engines on itch.io, and currently I think it's the most popular tool on itch.io and top seller. So pretty good representation there with respect to Ruby. The engine's been in development for about 6 years now. We've got 400 plus games on itch.io, so the community, our Discord community, is pretty phenomenal. And they'll hold game jams, and people just started to build games with it. This also includes my commercial titles. I've got commercial titles on iOS, Android, Nintendo Switch. Steam recently released my titles to Steam, so fully cross-platform game engine from that perspective. Performance always comes out with Ruby. So quick slide on that: 5K many-to-many collisions in DragonRuby. We get 60 frames per second. Unity gets 3 frames per second. Rendering 20,000 moving sprites, just to show off render limits, 60 FPS. Unity gets almost 10. Binary size, DragonRuby's at 6.8 for a universal binary. Unity comes in at 60 for x86. So those objective facets of the engine are nice, but for me, I don't want to be miserable building video games, right? That's the linchpin of the rationale with respect to using Ruby. And for me, Ruby begets innovation, right? And I think it's intrinsic to the language itself. And with respect to, I'm already like winded. I practiced this presentation last night. I'm like, why am I so winded? It's like, Colorado, I swear, why do you have to be? Oh, God. So it's the altitude. This is really serious, and I'm on this podium. It's terrible. So Ruby begets innovation, and these aren't actually slides. This is actually the game engine. And I didn't have a clicker, so I decided to use a PlayStation 4 controller to control my slides. But this is one of our tech demos within the engine itself. It was pretty interesting creating PowerPoint slides in a game engine. We actually have a built-in REPL, so I can go in and set my scene back to 0, and that takes us back to the first slide. So let's go back to our game. This environment's actually hot loaded. So I can go in and let's change the boat acceleration to 50, or the max speed to 50, and the acceleration to 0.5. Let's see how that affects the game. Yeah, I think that's working. But this is what I mean by Ruby begets innovation. Right? Okay, back to slides, I think. So with respect to lessons learned and the context behind them, it's one of the facets of Ruby itself. Like, you start using the language and it feels magical, right? It's hard, you feel that magic in the language. And one interesting facet with doing Ruby for game development in the Discord community was that we got an influx of new people using the language. They've never used Ruby. Some of them have never programmed before. And it reminded me what it felt like to feel that magic for the first time, because I get to see other people feel that magic. And with respect to the lessons learned, I was reminded what it felt like to be a developer from the very beginning and not knowing anything. And that's something that I, obviously after you do it for 20 years now, 25? Oh man, that's also probably why I'm winded right now. But you do it so long and you forget what it means to be a beginner. And so a lot of these lessons learned are contextual around that experience. Okay, so one of the terms that I found really useful is called progressive disclosure of complexity. Is that font size good? Mostly legible? All right. So this is a hello world DragonRuby application right here. And you have a tick function, and if I want to render a blue square on the screen, you have X, Y, width and height, a PNG, and then you shovel that information into an array, and you get a blue square in the corner of the screen. And the funny thing is that this has tripped people up. This very first slide has made people go, what is going on here? You have to learn what a method is. The or equal operator has tripped up C# does. Me being one of them, I did C# for 13 years before coming to Ruby, and I saw, what is that thing? Array literals, that one is not too terrible. You kind of really figure out that it's an array. And but this is kind of like your minimal understanding of the syntax and language that you need to have. We've got the positional arguments aren't great, so the question is like, how do we transition into something more interesting? Okay, so the next step of this progressive disclosure of complexity is we introduce the concept of a hash, curly brace, new token. The symbols for the keys aren't too terrible because it's kind of representative of JSON and JavaScript. So not too much trip up around that. The challenge comes when you want to update that information. So here I'm adding, I've got the concept of an angle that will cause the sprite to rotate. So this function is called 60 times a second. So every time you've got the reentrancy in there, you're going to see the sprite rotating. And I don't know if y'all remember, but the first time you encounter a symbol, when you don't have a language that doesn't have a symbol, you're like, what is a symbol? And it's so amazing, but it's like, how do we explain that to people? And this is the challenge that I became cognizant of with respect to learning a new language and trying to be productive in it. Okay, well, where do we take it from there? What if I want to have two squares? Okay, we create a function. Now we've got these split args. Where the heck did that come from? How do we explain that? It's only one arrow, but it's pretty, you can see the distance of the arrow. It's a little bit longer. And then once you get to multiple arguments, what is the next step? It's a class? It's a class, isn't it? Ow! New syntax, capital case, class macro, initialize correlation to new. Look how long that arrow is. It's just IVARs. How do we fix this? How do we fix this big jump? So one of the things that DragonRuby does, and it is introduce this idea of like maybe we can use a module in between. So you pull in. DragonRuby is actually based off of 3.0 syntax, so we don't have to have the split args to assign to the option parameters or the name parameters, which is nice. Another caveat that we changed is that in DragonRuby, hash responds to method missing. So the idea of you can access a key property using it quite like an attribute accessor. So you can use that instead of introducing the concept of simple, trying to defer that a little bit farther. And this has helped. And the idea of each one of the aspects of syntax within Ruby is that progressive disclosure of complexity. And then retaining that entire spectrum is what I like to call continuity of design. So it's so easy to say, all those arrays, hashes, all those things at the beginning, we're going to just throw it all away and just say this is how you're going to do a hello world. But it's not great. It's not great if you do that. And as an experienced Ruby dev, it feels obvious to maybe start at this point. but then you leave out all the newcomers. And that's one thing that I learned. One frustrating aspect of the module-based approach is that self keyword. I tried many different ways. You can do the class scope here, and now you have another indentation level. You can repeat the module name, so you can do something like this. You do square equals module.new, and then you flatten out the structure completely. I mean, what options do we have there? And so I decided to stick with the self construct, and it has eased the transition from just functions operating on hashes to modules to classes. And there's a facet of other programming languages that have dealt with the same problem. C++ being one of them. So there's a concept of nominal C++ or orthodox C++, and what they say is that we're going to throw away all the new stuff. We're going to use C as our baseline, small subset of C++, but everything else we're not going to touch, and never going to use it ever. And I don't know if that's the best approach to adopting language. And I thought about it. I was like, well, what does it look like in Ruby? So nominal Ruby, parentheses required everywhere. You do a put statement as parentheses. A method with no parameters, you add parentheses to it. No symbols, use strings. No trailing if statements, because that's confusing. The if is on the wrong side, right? Don't use implicit blocks. Use for loops and while loops only. No if statements. No lambda expressions, one-liners. This or equal, and equal, safe operator, don't use those. The punctuation on method names, that's gone too. Class macros use get set methods. None of this class macro stuff. I think I've described Python here at this point. And that's the thing. Is like if you told me to do that, this is what exactly would happen, right? The coordination of this was completely by accident. We can watch that again. Yeah, that's good. And so I wanted to figure out what we can put as a why do we feel that way? And I think for us, skill expression is an important facet of the language. So this is Yasuo from League of Legends. For those that have played the game, I'm sorry. Try to quit. Maybe join like an addicts group. I'll be there right with you. But the difficulty scale for Yasuo is really high. And here's kind of like a graph of the number of games played based on win ratio. And it's a little bit tough for Yasuo, but once we get to enough level of experiences, they start surpassing these other characters that are flatlining. This is the facet of skill expression that I think is putting a name to this feeling that I have with respect to the language. Okay, so Zen of Python, it says there should be only one and preferably only one obvious way to do it. There should be one and preferably only one obvious way to do it. Although that way may not be obvious at first unless you're Dutch. And that always, well, first it gets rid of that progressive disclosure of complexity and that continuity of design and saying like, this is the one way we should do everything. And that statement just really went against my mental facets of what I feel is valuable for the language. So as an example, here's Unity. And this is the obvious way to render a sprite. You have a prefab, you inherit from mono behavior. C# is a statically typed language, very good thing. So I'm going to define something called object of type sprite, and the compiler is not going to catch, unfortunately, this compiler error. And then the instantiation of this sprite is you pass in the square prefab, and of course this parameter is object also, a vector3, and then a quaternion.identity. And this is exactly, I mean, it's obvious, right? Imagine being a beginner and seeing inheritance, type safety with object, vector3 and quaternion.identity. And I don't know if that's something that's, I still don't know what a quaternion.identity is. So I don't know if this is ideal. And so just thinking about the Zen of Ruby this idea of progressive disclosure of complexity, continuity design, skill expression, putting terms to that and then reframing conversations around the language around these terms has been helpful. And one interesting thing with respect to game development is that they value these things. It's an artistic medium. They don't want to be a cog in a wheel that can be replaced, right? Swapped out, another person put back in. So this idea of skill expression and your skill increasing and not being limited by the language that you use is something that has resonated with in the context of the game community. So I wanted to, do we have time for questions, hopefully?
Oh, yeah.
Lots of questions, good. So that's the context of the slides in the talk, and then I wanted to open it up and make sure we have enough time for all the questions. So questions, thank you. So good 13 minutes for questions. I think so. 10 minutes? About 10 minutes? Questions? We can actually look at the slide code if you want.
Yeah, I'd love to see the slide.
We love PowerPoint code. All right, Control A. Trying to make this bigger. There we go. All right, so I kind of pushed all the like control and nuances into a separate file, and we can just look at what the slide code looks like. But the idea is that every function in my slide returns an array of primitives that need to be rendered. Okay. So there's a layout engine in DragonRuby, and we can actually take a look at what that looks like. So layout dot debug primitives, and then add our comma, save the file. Sorry, I shut down my game. Or slides. All right, and so this is kind of the layout engine right here. And let me invert the colors on it. Invert colors. True. And save. So you've got a 12 by 24, I guess, cell layout. So 24 across, 12 up and down. And then based on that, you can decide where you want specific things to be laid out on your environment. Right. So every function returns an array of primitives. I use that layout grid to kind of lay out all my specific pieces of the scene. For pets, I add a PNG. So I saved all those to a PNG and then threw it on the screen. That takes us to this slide right here, right? As far as defining the alpha, I've got a top level variable on my state itself that gives me the frame that the scene was changed at. You divide that by 60, gets you the elapsed time, and then I interpolate across this. That's how you get the fade animation from there. Like so, piece of cake. With respect to the rest of the slides, this common pattern ended up showing up where I've got this title, the current index that I'm on, the array of images that I want to show, maybe some subtitles and things like that. So you see, like when I go in between, we've got the different layouts and things fading in and iterating to the next slide. So that's kind of what I did here. The same structure is used except for the current index changes for each one. Right? And then some of these have additional information like, let's see, where's that? I have one called Revolt. So that was this slide, right? And so the idea there is that we've got some functions in DragonRuby that basically says, this is kind of like a PN-based frame-by-frame animation. Give me a point in time, the number of frames, how long to hold them, and I'll give you back an index for which animation to show. So that's basically it. The first PNG or the first animation has 144 frames at 4 frames per second, or 4 frames per tick, and then the other one's at 70 frames at 8 frames per tick. And then the meat of the code is this very large function here. Sorry for that. I did this at the last second. I didn't run the gems. Just look away. So we've got the as far as like the final positions for each one of the thumbnail images, and with respect to each one of the rectangles and how they move across the screen. The moving rectangle is the previous index, and it's got a linear interpolation to get to the final position where it's supposed to be at. Our title prefab is 2 labels offset by a little bit, so we have a drop shadow. So there's like the white label on top, and then a little bit of a black font below that. Subtitle prefab works the same way. And then your main slide, it's either, if it's the main slide, then it goes in the center. If it's a previous slide, then we're gonna, and I haven't disabled movement, then it's gonna use the movement animation. If it's less than, then use the thumbnail, and if it's greater than, then don't show it. And so there's your slide prefabs, and more layout stuff with respect to labels, and then all that is shown. So that is what gets you this layout right here. So all that code's in there, and then all the other stuff is data structures. Can we stop talking about PowerPoint? What percentage? The question was, what percentage of my users are not Ruby developers? I can only speak respect to the Discord community, but it's pretty high, surprisingly. So at least a 50-50 split. Just from my gut, we've got quite a few people that have used Ruby and said, "Oh, I've been using Ruby for a while now, and I want to get into game development." And that's a portion of our population, but there are people that say this is the first time I've ever used the language, and it's a nice split, which is nice. Yes. Yep. So the question was, is that our binary size is extremely small, and then I'm sure when you do brew install Ruby or sudo apt-get install Ruby or download Ruby from the website, you're dealing with a very large 2 GB binary. And with respect to DragonRuby, our baseline is actually based off of mRuby, and so we're using the embedded runtime. And my RubyConf presentation from I think 2022, we go into a lot of details with respect to like how the runtime works, what extensions and like enhancements we made to the language. But that was one of the facets of making it work cross-platform, was that we needed a zero dependency runtime, and so mRuby became our target runtime for that. Question? Yes. The question is there support for 3D rendering? Right now, we're only doing 2D, and so the primary reason for that is that I haven't built a 3D game, and with respect to experience and this idea of like continuity diagram, progressive disclosure, I can only speculate on the obvious way to render a 3D model to the screen, and it's a deficiency for my skill set. There have been multiple times where like we could totally do 3D, and we do have the ability to render triangles on the screen. So you could do like a ray casting and ray tracing stuff with DragonRuby, but we're sticking to 2D games from the domain expertise perspective. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, but then you introduce extend. So the question was like, if you want to get rid of self, you've got the self dot and then the function name. So what's another way you can get rid of it? Well, you can do an extend, or and eventually take that module and do an include in a class. But then you're introducing the concept of an extend. So and then it's self-referencing, which is I don't know. Yes. Yeah, so the question was, do we have any substantial open source games that someone can pick apart? Let's go to the Discord community. So The game engine actually releases with internet, please. The game engine releases with 150 some odd sample apps. So you've got you get kind of like a progressive disclosure of complexity even in the sample apps. They're ordered by easiest to most complex. Yes, there we go. So inside of the Discord community, we have, I usually point people to, it's an open source project. It's called Roguelike Tutorial 2021. And that's a pretty full-fledged reference implementation, including testing, multiple files, and the rendering aspects, and a large swaths of the system. But this Roguelike Tutorial 2021 is a pretty good reference implementation. Any other questions? That's a good question. So the question was, is there like a online or anywhere a conversation happening with respect to nominal Ruby, or the ideas around maybe easing that ramp up? And there isn't outside of our Discord server, so we get a lot of newcomers, and that's one of the facets of being able to start these conversations. But it's been our Discord server, and there have been situations where you have people that come in, experienced Ruby devs trying to help a beginner, and they fire hose them. It's like, oh, you can do this thing where you use an implicit block and instead of using this, and it scares some people away, and it's something I'm trying to discover. But yeah, it feels like it's kind of like a rare occurrence in the Ruby language. Yeah, and I agree. I think it's important to help that ease in process, and I think a facet of that is also within our domain and our libraries themselves. Is once we're in that exploratory phase and trying to figure out what this API and function will look like, with respect to the continuity of design, maybe it's okay to leave that point on the spectrum of solutions, and not just delete it out. You look at a Rails project and you do Rails new scaffold, and it's all these files, and I wish there was an environment that took me from Sinatra with the continuity of design with valid points on the spectrum all the way to Rails. And the fact that when Rails was built and said, we don't need all this stuff, it hurts. It really hurts a lot. Okay, I think we're at time.